Good morning, February 11th, 2022. Welcome to Triggered. I'm Cory Morgan. This is a Western Standards live show. It runs Monday to Friday, every day from 11:30 a.m. until I'm done talking to you, usually by about 1 o'clock or so. We bring on guests, we have commentary, we go back and forth, lots of ranting, lots of fun. I like the comments, and I see some are already coming in. Winston Smith was in quite earlier with a comment saying actually that we have people who pretend there isn't an easy way to stop the protests or isn't a way. And he says it's actually extremely simple. Drop all the mandates and give everyone who was wrongfully fired their jobs back. I wish it was that simple. I mean, it really is if somebody would actually do it. But unfortunately, the mix of politics and self-interest and a lot of things will prevent our leaders from taking that simple solution, at least in the short term. But let's hope some reason starts prevailing pretty soon. Ben Eldridge saying Western Standard should send Trudeau a Western Standard branded sippy cup with 2 handles. Yeah, we'll work on that. You know, for now, actually, we do have these nice new branded mugs here. And it does have a good solid handle because, you know, the chances of me spilling a coffee on my laptop can be pretty strong sometimes when I'm raging. But all the same, we'll see if we can get the sippy cups down the road and help Mr. Trudeau out when the time comes. So I've got a lot coming up today. I got guests, Marcel Latouche. He's the president and CEO of the Institute for Public Sector Accountability. And he wrote a column in the Western Standard talking about identity politics, division, and an issue we talked a little bit about the other day of the difference between equality and equity. I mean, the words are very similar, but the meanings can be quite different, and the interpretation is important. Michelle Stirling is going to come on after that. She's been on the show a number of times. She's with Friends of Science. And we're going to talk about a delicate subject, the graves some found and identified at residential school sites and some of the debates around it. And there was a 60 Minutes piece on it a little while back that really was a short segment and left out a lot of important stuff about those residential schools. So it'll be important to talk about and get the full details because it's a sensitive issue. It's a big one and we're concerned about it. So that'll be a good conversation as well. And I'll be talking to Dave Naylor in a little bit after I start my rant because he had an exclusive interview with Premier Jason Kenney last night, and he heard and learned a lot of things. It'll be there's some of the stories on the Western Standard already from Dave on that, and there'll probably be more to come because it was a good long conversation. We won't always hear everything you want to hear from the Premier when you get him, but it's important to be able to listen to him and see where he's trying to go. Well, listen, if you heard Doug Ford this morning, for some of us, it really got the blood pressure going up, I tell you. So getting on, I'm going to start on our sponsor actually before I really start into my ranting, and that is Algodex. These guys are an interesting Western company, and have a listen here.
Algodex is owned by Algonaut. This is great new technology just coming online now in the digital currency world. Algodex is a great way for you to use the digital currency Algorand in your day-to-day transactions. Can you imagine a world where we don't have to buy a cup of coffee using the federal dollar? And you don't even have to use the American federal dollar. You don't have to use the euro or the pound sterling. You can use real money, digital currencies that are not at the beck and call of governments and inflation. The Algodex is making digital currencies usable in a day-to-day basis.
So yeah, check Algodex out. They are an interesting and great local sponsor. We're going to start out, talking about this is where I rant. This is where I'm triggered. This is where I get going. This is my nature. That's why the show is named that way. But I'm, as Nico brought up the term we were talking before the show, and it's the right way to frame it. I'm an angry but peaceful guy. I never want to see violence. I don't. I have no use for violence. If it could be avoided, it should be. And I'm really starting to get worried about some things. So I'm still angry, but I want to make sure things stay peaceful, and I'm not sure if it's possible. So my excitement with the success of the Truckers for Freedom Convoy protest is starting to turn into apprehension. I mean, so far the protest has been a grand success. I felt something akin to national pride, which as an Alberta independence advocate is a rare thing for me. As I watch Canadians who are known for their passive approach to things take a stand by the thousands and firmly tell the government they've had enough. And they've done it through the truckers' protests. And Canada has actually inspired the world for a change, and not through government action, but through protesters. Freedom convoys are springing up in Australia, New Zealand, France, and the United States. I'm getting a thrill with every report I see of convoys in new nations that were inspired by us. That's something to be proud of. We got some backbone. We still are tough Canadians, and we're going to push back. The fundraising for the convoy, of course, has been incredible. Over 100,000 Canadians have donated to these funds, and despite the hardest efforts of the thieves in governments, it continues to raise millions. And it's not just the fact that the funds are aiding the convoy that disturbs the state so much. It's the fact that the giant fundraisers are indicating broad, dedicated cross-country support for the protest. It's a giant symbol of support, and opponents to freedom, of course, despise it. Now, as the government plays whack-a-mole chasing fundraising efforts around, they just look all the more petty and inept. While Doug Ford's been trying to use the courts to seize the funds in the Give, Send, Go fund, I think it's Give, Send, Go, he's failing. They put out a statement reminding him that they're outside of his jurisdiction and he can pretty much blow it out his ass. In response now, Doug Ford's declared a state of emergency in Ontario. I mean, the panic in his eyes is truly something. And he's speaking in threatening terms, and he's inflaming the situation. And Prime Minister Trudeau has never hesitated to pour gas on the fire as he villainizes protesters and their supporters and labels them as extremists and racists. The government has not even suggested discourse with the protesters at any level, and this is where the danger is coming in. On their end, the protesters are becoming increasingly frustrated, and they're getting more aggressive with their actions. The border blockages are causing serious economic damage on both sides of the border, and now it's springing up in multiple spots. They're making it clear they have no plans to move. But somebody on one side, or preferably both, has to start opening discourse. No more insults and no more unreasonable demands. A little bit of degree of sounding like there's room for compromise has to come into this. A Commons committee likened the truckers to terrorists. This is just the other night. I swear, they seem like they're actually wanting to provoke violence. Honking horns is annoying, but it's not terrorism, guys. Let's not undercut how serious that word is by labeling what have been so far extremely peaceful protests as terrorism. The government has to at least try to meet with the organizers, and to date they haven't done a damn thing. We know outright that Trudeau would have been out there meeting with those protesters within hours if it had been a BLM protest. Protesters can and should hinder movement in their areas. Civil disobedience, I mean, it's pointless if you're just standing on a street corner with a sign. But that said, you have to let some pressure off too. You have to let some traffic cross the border. Slow and hinder things up, but don't cork them. Pressure is building, and that's going to lead to an explosion soon. I don't want to see this magnificent movement end with tear gas, rubber bullets, and injuries, if not deaths, not to mention arrests and some of the things like Doug Ford is talking about, ruining the careers of people by pulling away their licenses and accreditations. Things have been incredibly peaceful, and that record can be maintained. Maybe I'm just whistling in the wind, and physical conflict between the state and the protesters is inevitable. I sure hope not, though. This incredible period of Canadian history can end positively, but as both sides keep entrenching further, the likelihood of that gets narrower and narrower. And I'm just really worried for it. So as I said earlier, I'm angry. I'm always angry, but I'm always peaceful too. I just don't want to see somebody get hurt out of this. And I'm really getting nervous as we go into this weekend and seeing where Doug Ford has gone and where Trudeau has gone. It's a frightening scene. All right, so let's get in, though, to talk to Dave Naylor, because he had quite a busy news night last night. He had an exclusive interview with Premier Jason Kenney. He's written some stories on it, and I'm sure he's got more he can add. Hey, Dave, how's it going over there?
Thank God it's Friday, Corey.
You're looking tired, but you're looking good, though.
Yeah, I was hoping for a weekend off, but I somehow don't see that happening. It's absolutely crazy in the news business this week, and it's continuing today. As you mentioned, I did have an exclusive interview with Premier Kenney last night. All sorts of good things coming out of that. Published 2 stories last night on his support for Leslyn Lewis to get into the race, and also his warning for truckers. They better get out of there or they're going to face significant penalties. Today, I've just published a significant story from the Premier. He has vowed that he will change the Municipal Government Act to take powers away from Alberta cities if they do not fall in line with his COVID guidelines. You'll remember on Tuesday, Corey, that the province dropped the vaccine passport program, and on March 1st will drop the forced masking program. City of Edmonton, though, has decided they're going to investigate whether or not they can bring in their own vaccine passport, and they're going to keep their mask mandate. City of Calgary has voted down Mayor Gondek's proposal to look at a vaccine passport, but they're also keeping their mask mandate till undetermined date. So yeah, Kenny's not happy. Kenny says If the province or if cities want to run the healthcare system, he is going to move and change the Municipal Government Act to take powers away from them. Also from Kenny today on the website, I guess not surprisingly, really, he says he has no plans to campaign for the UCP candidate in the upcoming riding of Fort McMurray-Lac La Biche. Of course, the UCP candidate is one Brian Jean, who has been one of Kenny's most vocal critics and is actively pursuing getting rid of him as a sitting MLA. So Premier says, he's still looking at his schedule, but I, for one, would be surprised if he made a visit during the campaign. Lots and lots of other major breaking stories on the site this morning already, Cory. Mel Risden has got an interesting story on a fairly high-ranking Canadian Armed Forces soldier. He's a major, and he's not happy with vaccine passports. So he's done a video in full Army regalia with his uniform. This is a guy, Cory, who went and served the country in Afghanistan, and now he's not happy with all the COVID regulations. So it's a compelling video, and I urge everybody to go and check that out. He's also going to be in big trouble, obviously, because the forces have mandated that no one is supposed to talk publicly about this sort of stuff. Other stuff, there was a UCP annual general meeting in the riding of Sherwood Park earlier this week that basically saw the election of pro-Kenny delegates or pro-Kenny board members. The opponents who want Kenny removed have filed a formal complaint about what they're calling the shenanigans that happened at the meeting. And they have a long list of fairly damning complaints about how the meeting was handled. Go Send Me or Go Send Go or whatever they're called, Give Send Go, has told Canadians that if they donate to their site, the Canadian government will have no access in trying to seize it. The Ontario government has said they're going to try and freeze that American fund, and the Americans say that is no way that's going to happen. And of course, Ontario, an emotional Premier Doug Ford declaring a state of emergency this morning, threatening truckers with $100,000 fines if they don't move away from the Ambassador Bridge. That's perhaps it is the key link between trade between Canada and the United States. Tens and tens of billions of dollars cross it every year. I think he said 200 million a day. So that's causing significant economic problems down in Ontario. So Ford has had enough. There's also unconfirmed reports of police officers from across the province going into Windsor now to get ready to enforce, get rid of the blockade. So hectic day is going to be a hectic morning and a hectic weekend, Cory. No rest for the week.
No, I suspect you're going to be hammering out some stories on the weekend, whether you want to rest or not. But we appreciate your dedication, and Mel and all the rest. I mean, news doesn't work banker's hours, I'm afraid.
Certainly doesn't.
All right. Thanks, Dave. I'll let you get back to it, and we'll carry on with the show there.
Thanks, Cory.
Great. So, yes, lots of news and food for thought. Some comments, I think, where did we see this? I'll scroll up. Cheryl, asking, how can the city enforce the vaccine passports when they don't have access to private medical info? I believe they do have to have the cooperation of the government to do that, and it doesn't sound like the Kenny government's going to be cooperative with it. Calgary looks like they're out. Edmonton wants to go in. That'll be one of the easier ways for, I think, Kenny to block the Edmonton, though. It's just say, no, that's provincial data and you don't get it. So too bad. They could try, I guess, to demand paper things in businesses. With Kenny overriding and adjusting the Municipal Act, if that's what it takes, so be it. I'd rather it didn't. I've talked about that before. I like seeing decentralized government. I like seeing local government having more authority and ability. But if they're going to step on the rights of citizens and businesses, then I guess the provincial government does have to step in. And, keeping a mask mandate passed when our provincial medical experts, because again, it's not municipal turf. They don't run the medical system. So stay the hell out of it. Mayors, councilors, come on, guys. Worry about dog crap on people's lawns, keeping the snow off our streets, and those other important matters of business that you're in charge of. Stay out of medical areas, and don't worry about making your condemnations of other governments and things like that. And if they bring in a mask mandate, that's going to be the bigger one, I think, more than the vaccine passport. We saw that with Nenshi in the past when the masks came off temporarily. He had to be pushed. He wanted to keep that mandate for a whole year, and the city finally relented under pressure. They held it out for one more week out of spite for citizens. I got a feeling that Gondek is not going to want to relinquish the mask mandates in Calgary, as are probably some other municipalities, which is going to put a lot of pressure on local businesses, restaurants. I was reporting on it and I've seen it. My local Impritis, busy as all get out, and restaurants all over the city have it. I got a feeling tonight is going to be a very busy night in the bars and restaurants all over Alberta, because all of those people, and we're talking, when you're talking 10, 15% of the population who hasn't chosen to be vaccinated, now can finally go out to those places. They've been waiting for months. They're going to go out. And if the cities start cracking down on them again, they're going to go to businesses outside of the cities if they stay home, or if they don't stay home altogether. And businesses are going to be they better be calling their city halls and saying, hey, cut this crap out. We can't compete. The other thing they're going to be inviting is, look at the protests. Look how things are going. Mayor Gondek, do you really want to see all those protesters setting up on the steps of City Hall every weekend? Because that's what they're going to do. Maybe even longer. You can't sit there as a holdout when the authorities higher than you, and they are higher than you, get over it, Jody, have said that the mask mandates are ending. So, but we're going to watch. These battles are going to go on. It's going to keep happening as the municipals and the feds and the province all push around all over the place. Kenny, with Dave was talking about with him, it's interesting to see. He's got a lot of stuff on his plate going on, talking tough with the truckers, but at the same time, trying to appease. He's walking a tightrope, and I don't think it's working out very well for him. But we'll be observing as it goes. So, yeah, he's got that Fort Mac by-election going on up there, which puts him in an uncomfortable position. He has the truckers' issues going on. And it was interesting that he talked about Leslyn Lewis, of all things, in the Conservative race. He didn't outright endorse her, but said it'd be great if she threw her hat in and entered. How strong his endorsement is worth these days is difficult to determine. It used to carry a lot more weight, but he's very low in popularity among a lot of people right now. And that endorsement might not be as valuable to Conservative contenders as it used to be. But we do have an unfolding race building up there. So I've got Marcel in the lobby there. I'm going to bring him in shortly here, but I'll talk first about our other sponsor before we get there. And that's the Canada Shooting Sports Association. Their name sort of speaks for itself. They're Canada Shooting Sports Association. They're a group of people who enjoy the safe, responsible, legal use of firearms in all the different ways you can. It's not just hunting. You could like target shooting. You might just like collecting the things. Maybe you invest in them and hope they go up in value like any other piece of property. And they have all the resources there. They have forums. They have links to where there's going to be trade shows. They have videos on good competitive firearm use or recreational firearm use. It's a great spot. If you own firearms, you want to be a member of these guys because it's a resource. They're an association of other firearms owners, and you can share information. And I think most important of all, though, is they are pushing back against the liberal laws that are trying to take away your ability to use, own, transfer firearms. They've been fighting that for years. The liberals always want to take them, and it's an ongoing battle. It never stops. So these guys are supporting, and they have 3 legal challenges out right now, I believe, on behalf of firearm owners. And they're pushing back against Ottawa, because if we don't, Ottawa will get away with it. We're seeing that with protests racking the country. If we let Ottawa walk all over us, they will continue to walk all over us. So check these guys out. Join in, help them out with these legal challenges, and help stand up for yourself. It's at cssa-cila.org, or just search it, Canada Shooting Sports Association, and see how they can help you stand up for yourself. So, okay, let's bring Marcel in. He wrote a column for us recently. That was his first guest column for the Western Standard, and it was a complicated one. Marcel likes talking about those philosophical, political issues, but a very important one. So how you doing, Marcel?
I'm doing fine, thank you. How are you?
Very good, very good. Things have been rocking along. We're very tired around here because things have been busy, but it's a good tired.
Yeah, so, I decided to do this because for the past couple of years here, I've been very worried about what is going on, not only in Canada, but in the Western world with regards to freedoms. When COVID came in, it actually sort of brought this to a head. And now we have the Freedom Convoy and stuff like this coming up. And I was, sort of motivated to write this piece because I think it's extremely important for us to start looking at where we are going, because if we do not do something about this very, very quickly, it's going to be too late for us.
Yes, and it's been very difficult, and it's been an insidious way that the woke have been dividing us, sort of, in identity politics and in policy. One of the areas you went into, and it was, it's tough to cover in just a paragraph too, though, is the difference between equality and equity. They're two very distinct words, even if they sound similar, but they have big different meanings and implications.
Absolutely. I mean, equality is about giving opportunity to everybody else. What has happened is, over the years, equality was something that everybody aspired to because it made everybody equal. I mean, if you look at France, for instance, fraternité, liberty, and inequality was their motto. In the United States, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In Canada, the North, strong and free. All these people were talking about the freedom to express themselves, to be equal in the opportunity to better themselves. What we have seen in the past 3 decades is that this has been slowly been eroded. And it has started in academia, where they have started pushing ideologies to a whole generation of kids who now do not even understand what is going on around them. And what we see is indoctrination. The unions are taking more of a say in public discourse today and pushing an agenda of the left. I mean, when we look at equity, for instance, it came by more and more in the United States, where people are looking at social justice. There is no doubt that the history of United States have been fraught with all sorts of racial and division in the past. But we've made a lot of progress. I mean, Martin Luther King said that what we should be looking at is the character of the people, not the skin color. But today, the left has taken everything in identity politics. And social justice is using skin color, gender to reform the way we look at things. You take Ivy schools, for instance. I mean, so Yale, Harvard, they've been sued now because there is disparity in the admission process between blacks and Asians. I mean, that's not equity. Equity doesn't mean that, you discriminate, whereas equality is everybody is equal. But Marxism has declared that, oh yeah, everybody is equal as long as some are more equal than others. And this is what's happening today in our world. You see corporations, you see most importantly, the high-tech industry censoring and doing things that we as ordinary citizens cannot do. The media is at the heart of it. If you look at the media in Canada, for instance, it's subsidized by a government. So what are they supposed to do? They sing from the same page book. And what happens is Canadians are not just misinformed. They are getting not fake news, because I don't like to use the word fake news. I use biased news. And this is where it's happening.
Yeah, it's a bad slant. And that was exposed pretty strongly not too long ago with one of the reporters at the CBC when she wrote, a great long blog, and I'm forgetting her name offhand, but it just eviscerated the corporation and said, she, as a person who considered herself quite progressive and left-wing, just could not even handle being in the room any longer with them when every story had to have a racial undercomponent. They were actually asked about such things. They were pushed towards, and again, it keeps dividing people. It's not addressing a problem of division. It's actually creating a division, and it's setting, I think, a lot of progress back. I mean, we've always got work to do, but we're going back to dividing each other instead of trying to learn to like each other. It's absurd.
It is. I mean, you take the freedom convoy, for instance. I mean, these people are complaining about mandates. We've had 2 years where we've been controlled by every government institution in this country. And when I say this country, I should extend it to every Western country in the world. We have been completely bamboozled. We say, go home, stay home, wear a mask. And if you don't wear a mask, you're going to get fined. Have you seen the fact that every time we say, if you don't, we will charge you or fine you? I mean, is this another tax? Is it another way to coerce people into doing things? The problem we have today is that every single level of government have little wannabe dictators putting new rules to control us. I mean, look at what has happened. Kenny decided to relax the mandates in Alberta. Not entirely, but some of it. Immediately, 4 members of council in Calgary said they would like to consider their own. In Edmonton, they are going to continue with their passports. I mean, what is going to happen to us is that we have allowed ourselves under the umbrella of fear of COVID to accept everything that government have told us for the past 2 years. After that, we don't know where we are going to go, because we've got to ask all these governments to remove and rescind all these rules completely off the books, because otherwise they will use it again against you at a later stage. This is why I am so concerned about what is going on as freedom. But let's look at what's happening. Are the freedom convoy being treated equally under the law, or are we using social justice to differentiate them from how Black Lives Matter or Antifa or any other groups protesting were treated before? This is the problem with social justice. We divide instead of being equal. We are. Go ahead.
I was just saying, yeah, the frustration and what really annoyed me with this, I mean, there's a debate to be had, and the government could take a strong stand and say, look, you know, whether you agree with them or not, you're putting people's health at risk, and these measures are important and so on. I mean, fair enough as far as the discussion goes, but they went straight to baselessly labeling these people as racists and as misogynists, and I mean, just these ridiculous comparisons. They went directly towards that, rather than even trying to make a case for the restrictions they'd already put in. And that says a lot.
Exactly my point. The left has been very, very adept at dividing us, divide to conquer. And we've got to look at this very seriously. And the media has been part of this, because if they do not give a clear, independent report of what's happening, the majority of people who do not study or research these things are being coerced into believing what the media tells them. I mean, let me give you something as an example, which is just totally out of here. We're talking about the Olympics these days. Donna Friesen of Global was on the news talking about how people are being manipulated of believing that the media is fake. I don't use the word fake. I just use that the media is biased. What she forgets is every single media outlet, except for a very few like you, the Western Standard or Rebel or something like this, give a totally unbiased information to the public. So much so that at the Olympics, she talked about what is happening in the United States with regards to two highly qualified athletes, instead of participating for the US, are participating for China. And she went about this for about 5 minutes. She in problem. She was talking about patriotism. Should these people represent China or not? But she forgot to go one step further. 11 Canadians are playing for Hockey China at the Olympics. So why don't you make this an informing piece of information on both sides of the border? What they do here in Canada in the media is they always take the bads from the United States, and that's what they report. They don't report what is the good in the United States or in the rest of the world. And we sort of compare ourselves to the bad, and they excruciated Pierre Poilievre immediately for saying, I want to be prime minister in a free country.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the standards they've set. I mean, why is it bad for him to say he wants to be in a free country? Yet that's this bar they've put. Everything any conservative says is immediately controversial for some reason, according to the bulk of our mainstream media. Or I was mentioning the other day, just a performer, Adele, had the nerve to say she loves being a woman. And,
exactly.
And people went hysterical, like back up a couple of steps and look how just insane the world has become. When you consider those statements to be controversial, we've been trained into a very bad place right now.
Cancel culture has been the biggest weapon used by the left. Freedom of speech is only for the left today. If anybody says anything outside of their ideology, they are supposed to be canceled. Look at the way our Rogan is being excruciated as opposed to Whoopi Goldberg. I mean, it's amazing. They want to fire him, but Whoopi Goldberg gets 2 weeks of suspension. This is what's happening. My article is about the fact that we've got to stand up for our rights, our constitutional rights. We have to look at ourselves in the mirror and say, do we want this? I mean, why do we continually have division in this country? Because the liberals have used this tactic to divide us to stay in power. I mean, look at people. Why are they so worried about the masks? The mask has been debunked. I mean, JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, has published 2 papers from Johns Hopkins. One says that the lockdown didn't prevent anything, virtually nothing in the death of people. Then yesterday, LinkedIn banned one of their papers that said there is such a thing about natural immunity. So if you don't tell us that we have to believe in science, but science from only one side, it's very difficult for people to make educated, informed decisions if you are getting only one side of the story. And this is where I think the media, the mass media, is beginning to be mistrusted today. We as the public have got to inform ourselves and start standing up and be aware that we have freedoms that are being eroded every single day by the division of identity politics as used by Trudeau, who cannot have an intelligent conversation and without bringing in Islamophobia, transphobia, homophobia in everything that disagrees with him. He has no argument at all to protect our freedom except for his attack and identity politics.
Absolutely. Well, and before we wrap, there's another subject I'd like to go into because it's an area you've written more on in the past. Of course, with the Institute for Public Sector Accountability, you've written a lot on different levels of government, public, accountability as the name sounds. And it sounds like we're going to have a standoff between our municipal politicians and our provincial politicians over which mandates are going to be reduced or removed or kept and when. Where should we be going on this whole jurisdictional mess?
It's very simple. It's very simple to me. Health has always been a provincial jurisdiction. It is not for little wannabe dictators to start taking power. And this is part of what I'm saying. People have got to be informed about jurisdictional areas that municipal and provincial have. I mean, this is why we have this disparity. The Chamber of Commerce of Calgary differs from the Chamber of Commerce in Edmonton. Calgary says, oh, we need to open it up. As a former businessman in the hospitality industry, they have been killed for the past 2 years. Some of them would never recover. What is the role of the Chamber of Commerce, for goodness sakes? Is to protect commerce. Commerce is business. You cannot support closing business for 2 years and continue to demand that it continues after 2 years. I mean, they keep talking about economics. I mean, come on. Economics is very simple. If you cannot operate a business, you're going to have to close. And this is part of the economics. The Chamber of Commerce should be promoting the reopening under certain conditions so that we can have a normal life again. We are going to have to live with COVID, Omicron, or whatever it is. It is another flu. But you know what is really important, Cory? We've been talking about this. We want our freedom and everything we want to get back to normal. There's one thing that most people, most politicians have not discussed openly. What is and where was the origin of COVID-19? And they are not talking about it. And for what reason? Do they know something that we don't know? While they are putting more rules on us to erode our freedoms.
Well, I'm not sure about that, and there is a lot of discourse on it, but the politicians certainly don't want to get into it. We've got a whole lot. We're going to be studying everything that happened over this pandemic for decades. Let's just hope that we get our freedoms to be able to look back and start figuring out what we did wrong, which is a heck of a lot, and maybe a few things that we did right. But we got to keep pushing and pulling and talking about things, and keeping that free speech is the most important part, and that's what you speak up for as well in your column, Marcel. So I really appreciate that. I saw a commenter before I let you go was asking, where can they follow you? Where can they find out more about what you talk about? Because you've always got lots to share.
Well, I'm going to put a longer version on my blog. Oh, by the way, there's freedom for you. I was suspended from Facebook, posting anything on Facebook for the past 30 days. I shall be back in 3 days, and follow me on my Facebook page. And I will give you the direction to the Institute for Public Sector Accountability and other blogs.
Great. Yes. Yeah. You're in Facebook jail for a bit there. Okay. So you can look up Marcel Latouche on Facebook, and he will be there in a few days. And again, if you Google public sector or the Institute for Public Sector Accountability, you can find that. And Marcel has also written a number of books, actually, which you can take out. It's some great stuff on governance and policy. So the guests are, they're thanking you for coming on. They appreciate it, and so do I. And I hope we get to talk again soon, Marcel.
I just want to finish one thing.
Sure.
If the public doesn't want to do it for themselves, please, please, please do it for your children, because that's our future. If our freedoms today is eroded, they will not have the freedoms for their kids in the future. Thank you very much for having me, Cory. And until next time, have a nice day.
You bet. Always a good time talking to you, Marcel. Always informative.
Bye-bye.
So, and just a reminder, if you go to westernstandardonline.com, that's where Marcel's last column is. I'm hoping we'll probably get further ones from him down the road here. My next guest in a little while, I'll have Michelle on. She's done regular columns for us, and she's very prevalent throughout social media and other areas too. So we'll get to that, but we got a bit of some kind of open time going on here before we get there. I should remind everybody, though, we are an independent media outlet, as Marcel was talking about. The mainstream media, the legacy media, they're sick, they're corrupt, they're slanted, and they're tax funded. That's what does it. When the state has you by the fiscal knackers, you have to dance to their tune, and we don't, and we won't. So we don't take any kind of funding or subsidies or anything like that, but we rely on members. So take out a membership, check it out. Go to westernstandardonline.com/membership. For $10 a month, you will find it worthwhile. You get a free trial for a couple of weeks, or even $99 for a year if you commit for a year, of course, bulk savings. And People who try it out for the 2 weeks, it's like well over 90% after the 2 weeks come up, say, yeah, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to pay $10 a month. It's basically, it costs you as much as a old newspaper subscription you used to years ago, and those would pile up on your steps. Now you can get that. And as you can see, Dave is just constantly pounding out those stories along with Mel and Amber and Reed and such a giant growing News Corps Plus columns. So help us take out a membership, guys, if you haven't already. And make sure to subscribe to the Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, as somebody else was pointing out. I saw one of the commenters, because, of course, we get canceled everywhere. Rumble doesn't do that. That way, when the news breaks, when stuff comes up, because we got people out there on the ground, you'll see that live alert when we have a breaking issue. And it's happened. We've suddenly, hey, we got a guy there who's filming, and we want to cover it as it breaks. So before I get to Michelle, let's talk about a few other things. We're talking about freedom and that, an upbeat video and an issue that's going to be pressing next week, because the students in Alberta are going to be unmasked. In school, K to 12, kids won't have to wear masks in class anymore. And a lot of people have been looking forward to that. Some aren't. But let's play this. This is in Nevada. I showed one from Israel the other day. This is some kids in Nevada and how they responded when they found out that they won't have to wear masks in school any longer.
Starting tomorrow, we don't have to wear masks anymore! Is anybody excited?
It's fun watching kids. Nobody can express themselves better than kids. They aren't sour-faced like myself and things like that. They make it pretty clear they're happy to see those rotten masks gone. And they should be. I mean, you can't smile at each other. You can't express. You can't talk. We are stunting the development of our children by masking them like this. I mean, if there was strong evidence that it's protecting them from something, of course we want to keep them. Whatever you have to do, it's our children. But that evidence is clearly showing, that the risk isn't terribly high. So at least at the point where you have to balance that risk benefit, the masks got to come off. And they're coming off all over the world. And in Alberta, they're coming off on Monday. And the teachers union in Alberta is having conniptions about that. They are furious. They do not want this to happen. They think it's going to put their teachers at risk. That's what they're saying. If those kids are not wearing a mask, teachers will be put at risk. Where do they get their crap from? But it's a union. You got to remember, they're there to self-serve. This is the same union that takes care of the disciplinary matters for teachers that I've written on repeatedly, because they tend to give light sentences to sex offenders among their ranks. And hey, don't get too worked up. I'm not making stuff up. People have watched that. They watched it covered. They are a self-governing group. And if a teacher has been acting inappropriately with children, the disciplinary group that watches that is the teachers union. And they've been pathetic with it. And I know, I'm not saying that there are loads of abusive teachers out there. No. The vast majority of teachers still, of course, that's why they got into it. They love the children. They want to do well by them, and they certainly won't abuse them. But there's always, unfortunately, a number of predators out there. And that union, rather than trying to flush them out, runs coverage for them. And it's unforgivable. And whatever their mandate, their motivation to keep everybody masked is, I'm not even sure. But it's ridiculous. If they care for the kids, they should be saying, yes, let's get rid of those darn masks. Think of masks. I mean, people keep saying, oh, it's just a minor inconvenience. No, it isn't. It isn't. When I used to own my bar, I had a regular customer, Craig, fantastic guy, would come up. He's deaf. He's born deaf. And I don't know sign language aside from a couple of things and maybe some insults. But he was a fantastic lip reader. So he would do his orders, and we would communicate back and forth as he would read my lips. Well, his world's been just exceptionally miserable because of everybody masked in front of him. You can't read lips if they're masked. You're breathing your own breath. They're uncomfortable. They're not a minor inconvenience. And they're a symbol. They're a symbol of submission. They're a symbol of bondage. Hey, go to some BDSM site and look at all the subs. One of the first things you'll always see is a mask on their face. Not that I frequent those places or anything, but I've heard that sort of stuff goes on out there. But those masks say a lot, and it's humiliating to be forced to wear a mask. And we are being forced to wear masks. So it's not a minor thing to push back on that and say we've had enough of it. People who choose to wear a mask, go ahead. Of course, go to town. But enough of having the government forcing you to have a mask on your face and forcing our children to. Now, the government now has been, I'm going to move on from that, though. I'm seeing progress, like I said, that we're seeing pressure. And with the Liberal Party, the federal one, talk about stubborn with Trudeau. they've got MPs that are starting to come out against the restrictions, against the mandates. And it's great because that's a party that holds a tight ship. These guys don't typically have anybody leaking out. We conservatives, we do that to ourselves all the time. Oh, a conservative member came out against their leader. Yeah, what is it, 2 o'clock? Yeah, okay, 3 o'clock, there'll be another one. That's what we do. We're just, it's difficult with people who are independent thinkers to try and keep them all in the same room on something. But Joel Lightbound with the Trudeau Liberals, I mean, it was already news. He came out and really was eviscerated Trudeau on that. But Jane brought something to my attention. Yeah, there it is. With a quote from his in another article. Not everyone can earn a living on a MacBook in a college. And he never said specifically who was earning a living on a MacBook in a cottage. But I think we could all read between the lines there. But it says a lot. When you've got Liberal MPs coming up like that, it means they've got support in caucus because they don't fear being kicked out. I think we're starting to see cracks in that Liberal machine finally. And it's a strong machine. You can't underestimate them. They are political players. They're unprincipled. They're nasty. I do not like them. I will never vote for them. But you got to respect their political play. They know what they're doing. So when you're seeing those cracks coming from within, though, that could quickly lead to shattering. I got a feeling there's a number of Liberals that want to have a different face heading their party going into the next federal election. And they might finally tear that hammerhead of a leader of theirs out of his seat and move on to getting somebody else in there. Unfortunately, they might get somebody who's going to win another election. We'll deal with that when we get to it. But sure would be nice to be without Trudeau. And I got a feeling an increasing number of federal Liberals are actually saying the same thing. So that's good to hear. Another thing they backed off on, for example, was that data scoop with the Canadian cell phones. You know, millions of people, they were tracking you, they were following you. That's how scary the world's getting. And now at least a Commons Ethics Committee has gotten up and said, no, get that out of here. We do not do that. It's disturbing that they even tried. And the Commons Committee was told by the Ontario Privacy Commissioner that she was staggered by this. Staggered. And it's true. I mean, wow, where does this government think it is? Who do they think they are when they feel that they can track where the citizens are all the time without their permission? Yet this is an empowered government. That's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about, symbols of dominance. That's what Marcel was talking about. You know, this motivation to keep us asking permission for rights. Look, the government should be begging us to set them aside temporarily at any point. The default should be freedom. Default. They should be making a very hard case before infringing on any freedom, even a tiny little bit. And the second it doesn't seem justified, that freedom should be given back. But it's gone the other way around. They've taken it without asking. We've unfortunately initially gave it up. That's why everybody's fighting to get them back now. And it's humiliating to have to beg these political masters to do something as simple as go into a business without a friggin' mask on. You know, we are in a backwards, bad place, but citizens are starting to push back, and it's good. We can get there. All right, I'm going to go on more about our wretched mainstream media because my next guest held some of them to account there, and that's Michelle Stirling. She's with Friends of Science, and she writes columns for us now and then. You know, just speaking for herself, I believe this wasn't a Friends of Science column so much, and it was on, you know, as a sensitive subject, and that's the grave sites found or, you know, potentially found around residential school sites, and some of the coverage of it and some of the reasoning behind, you know, why there were so many people buried around those schools, because there was a 60 Minutes piece done on it that really kind of left out a lot of big factors that were involved in that period of time when there were residential schools that would have killed children. And it should be covered. Why do you omit these things when you have major coverage of things? I mean, 60 Minutes used to be a fantastic investigative program. It really was. I mean, the old 60 Minutes, I'm dating myself, you know, but from the 70s and 80s and that, I mean, it was a must watch. And it's just turned into more woke pap, unfortunately. So let's bring Michelle in and talk about her column and what she was writing on with that. Hey, Michelle, how you doing?
Good. Thanks, Cory. Thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. I'm glad to have you back. So your column, like I said, it's such a sensitive area, but people can't be afraid to talk about it because it is a big one that a lot of Canadians are concerned about, and we're still gaining evidence about what happened there. And I guess it wasn't exactly misinformation from 60 Minutes, but it was kind of misinformation through omission.
Yes, a glaring omission. So 60 Minutes and Anderson Cooper recently did a piece on the residential schools and the unmarked graves. And as you say, it is a sensitive issue, and it is very tragic for many people, very painful. But it should be noted that during the time period of the residential schools, tuberculosis was the biggest killer of everyone in society, and more so in these schools, partly because many of the children who came there probably had latent TB, which manifests itself in small children when they are undernourished and under stress, and all those things would have been true. And anyone who goes to a boarding school, feels that separation of family and culture, the strangeness of things. And so the TB was prolific at the time, and much higher numbers of people died of TB in Aboriginal communities off reserve, on reserve, and also in residential schools than the numbers proportionately in Maine society, even though it was also one of the greatest killers in Maine society as well. And, it just seems odd that 60 Minutes wouldn't even have mentioned that. I mean, that's a huge factor. So,
well, yeah. And I mean, just trying to explore the rationale as to why so many children were buried there, as it appears. I mean, I think most people agree it was a horrible, misguided policy. We can't imagine. I mean, having somebody come along by force, essentially, and taking your children away to a distant school, it was a terrible policy, and it was an awful mistake. And the fact that they didn't show the respect, at least, of perhaps returning the bodies to those families when those children died in those schools, there's a lot to unpack there. But people talk as if there'd been a mass murder or something, or that there'd been abuse that had killed those children. And we do have to look at the real killers of children in those days, and it impacted residential schools like anywhere else.
Well, I would say that there is a counter narrative. I recommend that people look at some of the research by Robert Carney. He was a professor of history at the U of A. He was also a Catholic school administrator of residential schools. And his son, Mark Carney, is, of course, the climate czar. But Robert Carney wrote many academic papers on the residential school system. And you have to remember, in that time, there were hardly any qualified teachers. In the early days, there were no public school systems. There were no public health systems. And in one of his articles that I was just reviewing this morning, he talks about how many times the residential schools served as the only local medical facility. And they also served many people whose children who were orphaned, children who, there were no social welfare systems then, so they were the net that captured disabled children, people with chronic conditions. Even sometimes the homeless or strangers would be given sustenance at these schools. And obviously, people died in those days. They died in great number because there were very limited medical facilities. And when someone died, you buried them right away, because first of all, to ship a body somewhere, you had to have a coroner's certificate. And if a person died of contagious diseases, and I believe that's even true today, it's illegal to ship them over a border. So, you'd have to have a sealed casket. The coroners were not in the area necessarily. Of course, these schools were in varying places. Some were really in remote locations and some were near cities. But it's also on the historic record that most people were buried with a marker of some kind, a small wooden cross or a little wooden headboard. But, over 100 years, that would disintegrate. So it's not that the people were buried with disrespect. I believe from the historic record, they were buried with respect, but those graves were not kept up. And, really people have, there's a documentary called The Forgotten Plague, which was done by PBS, I believe. And it gives a real good perspective of that time. And I've written an article that's on Medium about this topic, quite a lengthy article, but in it I also quote a number of references of academic papers where people were sent to tuberculosis sanatoria, and many Aboriginal children did go there on the assistance of the government to get well. But the same kind of problems happen from going to a sanatorium as would happen going to a boarding school. In the sanatorium, sometimes people were there for like 7 years and they were not able to see their family at all. They were very well fed because that was the method of getting people well. But in one case, one boy came home and his family didn't know who he was. He had 2 or 3 younger sisters and brothers already. They'd never heard of him. He looked funny because he was fat. He hadn't been out, running around in the countryside, so he was very pale-skinned and, had no connection. But this same kind of problem happened also in Ireland, happened also in the United States. And likewise, these children in other places also were abused, because it does happen in, in a residential facility. If there's no one there to protect you and there's some creep on the staff, then, young children would be subject to abuse. So I'm not trying to take away from the tragedy of death. I'm not trying to take away the loss of connection with an unmarked grave. And I'm not trying to take away the reality that many children suffered terribly, some, I would say, criminally. But there are also other sides of the story where there were no other options at the time. And I think that we have to see the broader picture of the time and the historic context. And 60 Minutes did a terrible disservice to the public by leaving out the fact of tuberculosis. And not to mention, in the US, they were running Indian wars and actively killing and oppressing people from 1622 to 1924. So pretty rich of 60 Minutes to stomp all over Canada.
Yes, absolutely. And it's just, there's more nuance to that whole issue. I mean, I think, again, just a lot of the visuals we took, when you see so many graves and you think of children, and we do care. I mean, we're horrified, but we do want to examine it, and we have to examine it with a bit of a set aside emotion for a minute and look at the motivations at the time. And yeah, as you said, predators, unfortunately, with children, I'm sure always throughout history, they've always snuck in to try and get around them. That's what they've done. That's why they tend to, when we find them even today, they've surfaced around kids' camps or areas where they can get access. And unfortunately, they were drawn to those residential schools. But I imagine a lot of the people managing those schools were trying to make do with what they had to do benefit for those children, or at least felt they were going to. As you said, if you had a reserve community that had a tuberculosis outbreak, you didn't have many means to treat the people and children in that community, and you would bring them to an isolated center for treatment.
Mm-hmm. And that's, in fact, why the government of the day chose these schools to run, or these religious orders to run these schools, because in most cases, they already had people on the ground. In some cases, there's a paper by Zilm and Warbenek about BC and the early nursing of TB there. There was TB quite rampant throughout BC because of the gold rush. And so these many times Catholic orders, religious orders had set out little outposts. And so they were already there on the ground. So it was logical that, okay, they know people in the area, they have a physical location. Let's get them to set up a school and run it from that location. So, it was a natural kind of progression. And it's true that, the means offered to these schools to feed and clothe and care for the children were very limited and parsimonious. But, Canada was very poor at that time, and everyone was poor. Like, it was, this is a time when, especially in the early days, you have to remember that children as young as 4 were being sent to work in coal mines. Children as young as 3 were used as chimney sweeps in London. So, little children were not seen as the jewels that we see them as today. They were seen as small men, who should be treated more or less as an adult, and not treated with the kindness and understanding that we offer today. So the historical context is so important to this story. And it's too bad 60 Minutes had a great opportunity to set some of that context, and they did a big fail.
Yeah, well, and there's a couple of things you brought up. Tuberculosis, Spanish flu also swept across, of course, the prairies, and it decimated families all over. And I've mentioned it on the show a couple of times before. Janie and I had our wedding pictures taken in a cemetery. I really enjoy cemeteries. They're peaceful places of memorials. And when I worked in the eastern states, actually, when I was surveying, and I would find them, and they were fascinating. But you would see, particularly during the period of the Spanish flu, family plots. You'd find little ones in the woods with only 50 or 60 graves, but they had stone at least, so you could read them, and you would see entire families wiped out in the course of a year. It was horrible. And this wasn't residential schools. This wasn't natives. This was just that there was a disease in a period of time when we didn't have good medical facilities, and you had to bury them where you were. That's why there were those small cemeteries, not a big centralized one.
That's right. And there was a lot of decimation in residential schools during the Spanish flu period as well. And in some cases, there are mass graves because, if you had 5 or 6 people die in short order, and Spanish flu generally took adults and not children, so there would be fewer people to dig those graves. So whoever there was to dig the grave, you had to dig it and bury the people as soon as possible because it was a very contagious condition. But, there's lots of records of men coming east on the harvest trains during the Spanish flu period, where there'd be 9 men in bunks on one of the trains coming west. They all died, people who would be going to some remote location in Saskatchewan to a hardware shop, walk in and find both the proprietor and his wife dead on the floor from Spanish flu. So, it was a horrible time, and one that nothing could have been done to prevent those deaths. And those who survived, did live through a horrible time, and undoubtedly that's marked them forever.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think anybody really wants to understate what happened. Then we just want to get to the bottom of something that was so tragic in a lot of ways, but we can't do it if we're not going to examine every fact and every factor and thing that contributed. Cheryl Dawn, a commenter, said there was also a massive fire at a Kelowna school, and yeah, these schools unfortunately were often, again, when it comes to that underfunding, they were rickety, they were fire traps, and some disasters could happen, and that would lead to, unfortunately, to some quick number of deaths for people, and that brings about a potential mass grave. We don't want to understate things. We just want to see the facts. And as you said, with such a big production, something that's so heavily watched, just 60 Minutes, it was just tragic that they refused to talk about some of the contributing factors as to why those children died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, again, the historical context is very interesting. And I recommend people look up Robert Carney and read some of his papers. They're very well researched, very detailed, and he sets that context. And he goes way back to the 1600s, back in Quebec, where there were early residential schools or day schools where the Jesuits were working with Aboriginal youth, and often at the request of the parents of these kids. Because, even if you look at the words of Chief Crowchild in Calgary on the signing of the Treaty 7, he said the RCMP came and protected us like a bird protects its nest with its wings, and stopped the whiskey traders from coming in because they were decimating our people. And really there were many good things about the RCMP coming west, and they are regularly denigrated with respect to them taking people away from their parents in terms of the residential schools. But if you look today at the COVID crisis, look how polarizing COVID has been in society, and look at the fact that in some cases, some authorities are planning to take children away from their parents if they're not vaccinated or not willing to vaccinate their kids. So we see that these authoritarian kind of moves are being made in contemporary society. Now, perhaps we can also understand that maybe that was a factor happening back then too.
It's a very valid point that can apply back then to today, and we just have to examine and look at things as much as we can. And I mean, closure, the more information we can find out, the better the chance for closure for the families and for their generations who were impacted by those institutions at that time. So I appreciate the frank talk about it.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one other thing as well. I have found historical documents indicating that in that time of rampant TB, in mainstream society, people often would bury family members without a gravestone or marker because it was thought that TB was hereditary. And so they didn't want to be ostracized from society. And, again, that there's an echo there today of what's going on in society where people, are divided by their vaccination status. And, it's caused huge rifts in society. So maybe we can incorporate a bit of that thinking into our understanding of history.
Absolutely. I mean, look at what was done to lepers, but we could do a whole separate show on that altogether. Where can we find more information on what you're doing, Michelle? I mean, we get your columns here at the Western Standard, but I know you're active in many other places. Before going,
I have a little blog, michellestirling.com, and I also have a number of articles on Medium, on the sort of mainstream blog called Medium. So you can have a look there.
Great. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Michelle. I always like chatting with you, and I appreciate you again having, it takes some courage to dig into the unpopular views, but the important ones. So I appreciate it and hope we talk again soon.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Cory.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. So just again, that was Michelle Stirling, and yes, she's involved with, well, she's just a very active person, does a lot of writing and investigating. So check her out. If you search Michelle Stirling, you'll find that blog and the Medium site and all of that. Dave has been in the lobby. It sounds like something is breaking. Hey there, Dave. What's going on out there?
Cory, we have breaking news on two fronts. Prime Minister Trudeau is holding a press conference as we speak about the truckers. He revealed that he's been on the phone today with U.S. President Joe Biden. They were discussing the global influencers and the U.S. citizens that are taking part in the blockades. They both agreed that it has to end. Trudeau pointed out that he doesn't control the RCMP, but he certainly left every impression that the RCMP are very imminently going to move in and break up these protests. He's urging people with children in the protests to go home, and basically the situation seems to be coming to a head very quickly, Cory. Also, the United States defense officials are saying that the Russian invasion of the Ukraine will happen next week. They need to get in there before the spring thaw, and the ground needs to be frozen for their artillery and their tanks. So they expect it to begin early next week with heavy bombardment and loads of casualties. Prime Minister Trudeau commented on it at the press conference, saying in the economic sanctions, if they do go in, will be severe. And now United States citizens have been told to get out within the next 24 to 48 hours. The British, the Koreans, and the Japanese also warning their citizens to get out before the Russians move in. So it looks like we're going to have a very unfolding tragedy happening in the Ukraine next week.
Wow, that's some scary stuff. Our columnist Dave Makachuk, who writes on international issues, and he talked about that. We figured the time would come. I mean, it was clear they were getting ready to go, but it shows how fickle and weird our world is. You're figuring they were going to wait till the end of the Olympics to do it first, so they wouldn't hinder their friends in China. But boy, that's huge. I mean, the world could be tumbled into a war. We just don't need that right now.
Yeah, our reporter Eva is putting together a story. She's also talking to people who just returned from the Ukraine less than 2 days ago, and she'll have an interview with them about the mood that the country's in. But it's not going to be good, Cory.
Okay, well, thanks for bringing us up to date on that, Dave, and I'll let you get back to the Trudeau conference. My condolences in having to listen to that. And
somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to do it.
Keep the stories are going. All right, thanks, Dave. So there we go. And yeah, we are a live show. These things break as we go. I think a lot of us have kind of felt the rumblings of both of those coming up. We could tell whether it's from Doug Ford or even some of the rumblings from Kennedy, from Trudeau, they are all getting at the point where they're going to start coming in by force and trying to tear down these protests. And this weekend, I fear, is going to be a very tumultuous one, I guess, to say the least. I just hope nobody gets hurt. I don't know if it's avoidable or not. I'm very concerned. And yeah, the Russian thing, sliding back there in the radar. And, when I was talking to Makachuk about that, it's a nuanced thing. Like Eastern Russia, there are a lot, or Eastern Ukraine, I should say, there's a lot of citizens who identify more strongly with being Russian than Ukrainian. And the Russians, of course, and Putin have been kind of helping them and inflaming them to more of a civil war sort of thing. Meanwhile, of course, Western Ukrainians have absolutely no desire to be part of Russia again. Russia under Stalin, horrifically abused Ukraine, starved them. It was one of the worst acts of purposeful genocide in history. The communists don't get nearly as much credit for the horrific acts against humanity that they did. And the Ukrainians suffered massively under it. I mean, we all rightly condemn that vile piece of human excrement, Hitler, who walked the land and murdered millions of Jews and other people in concentration camps throughout Eastern Europe. But Russia was little better. And now these guys, it's not the communist regime of them, but it's Russia again. And it looks like they're going to go into Ukraine. This isn't something to be dismissed. And then, Dave and I talked about that. When an expansionist country starts doing things like that, they don't stop. Putin's not just going to take out a bite of Ukraine and say, okay, yeah, we're satisfied now, we'll stop. They're not going to stop. They want the big Russian Empire again. They're going to start with Eastern Europe. They're going to want Bulgaria back. They're going to want Poland back. They're going to want Hungary back, Yugoslavia, or, the Czech Republic. They're not going to stop, guys. This is a rogue expansionist regime. There is no good reason, acceptable reason for Russia to cross that border and force themselves into that country. And yet that looks like that's what they're going to do. This is very, very serious. And the world is not in a place to counter it. Biden said there was 8,000 troops on alert, and they're sending some more out there. Canada might send a handful of perhaps, if we can. I know we were offering loans to the Ukrainian. We don't have much of a military to speak of anymore in Canada. We have to admit that. And Russia has 100,000 troops on the border of Ukraine. There's not going to be any stopping them when they choose to go in. The bigger issue, I think, is going to be, how do you contain them after that? As I said, they don't stop. And if you look into military things, moving that many troops is not easy. It's a logistic, massive endeavor to do, and expensive. And to occupy and then just sit there with that invasionary force, again, they're not just going to sit there. You've expended, you've committed. And that's where I see they're going to expand further. In the world, as if we haven't dealt with enough with a pandemic and all this other crap, and we suddenly are looking at war breaking out in Europe. Just what we need, right? Well, we'll be watching that closely, and we'll certainly be reporting on it as things break, whether it's the international or the domestic stuff with Trudeau or anything else. What a crazy world we have on the go today. Before I get up to the last couple issues and show closer, I should talk about our sponsor again with Algodex, and I'll reboot here.
Algodex is owned by Algonaut. This is great new technology just coming online now in the digital currency world. Algodex is a great way for you to use the digital currency Algorand in your day-to-day transactions. Can you imagine a world where we don't have to buy a cup of coffee using the federal dollar? And you don't even have to use the American federal dollar. You don't have to use the euro or the pound sterling. You can use real money, digital currencies that are not at the beck and call of governments and inflation. The Algodex is making digital currencies usable in a day-to-day basis.
Okay, that's Algodex. That's a Western Canadian company, and they've been making some great inroads lately. Check them out, algodex.com. A great sponsor as well. So lots of issues to cover, lots of stuff to talk about, guys. Make sure to go to the Western Standard online.com, take out a membership. Dave's going to be pounding out those stories as they keep breaking. We're obviously in for a very busy weekend of news. That's where it's going to come out, and we're going to report on it. We get people on the ground. We'll try and cover it as well as we can. Something that I believe Mel's working on, and there's some videos, but Premier Kenny recently said there's only like 30 tractors down at the border with Coots. There's a great deal more by the sounds of things, and there's a great evidence of that. We're going to be reporting on that. Exposing that. Come on, guys, don't feed us BS. Let's at least be honest with what we're doing down there before you consider moving in. And I'd really rather you didn't. So keep an eye on the website. We'll bring those things out as fast as they happen. I'm going to close it up, I think, at this point. It's Friday. It's been a long, busy news week, and it looks like we got another one coming up ahead. I thank you all very much for tuning in with us this week. Thank you guys who've sponsored. Be sure to follow up and, hey, share this. This is how we can beat the mainstream media. This is how we can beat the bad information that you're being fed from the legacy media, is spreading around them and getting that information and discourse to people despite them. So thanks for your support. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you all on Monday, guys.